I came here to go to school at Concordia College in Seward. And my husband and I left, I met my husband there. We left Nebraska and went to Sioux City, Iowa, where we taught for several years, and then moved back to Seward to teach. And we stayed because we like it here. And have managed to find, we've managed to change careers several times without having to leave the state or even the town. Nebraska has had a big influence on me. I've lived here since I was, well, since I was 18, pretty much. I was gone for a couple of years and then came back. One of the things I really like about this state is that not everybody wants to live here. There aren't a lot of us. And because of that, we tend to know each other, and we know the parts of the state, and we can make a difference much more easily, I think. I like that about Nebraska politics. There are only 49 senators. Almost everybody knows his own or her own state senator. Most of us have met the governor and the Secretary of State. I like being close to the governmental structure here. I like the populist spirit of the state, and I think it's made me appreciate the sense of community that we have in this state, both in our individual towns and as a whole, too. I think there's a strong bond of community. I enjoy writing in general. I like the way words go together. And there were times when I had wished that I could be a fiction writer. And in college, I took some courses in fiction writing, poetry, creative writing in general. I enjoyed poetry writing. I was a total flop as a fiction writer. I just never wrote anything I enjoyed at all, and decided that was not where I was going to find my fulfillment. And but yet there's using words in nonfiction can be very rewarding also, and very creative. Being a journalistic writer is different from being a fiction writer or poetry writer, certainly. Sometimes people might think off the top of their head that that means it's less creative writing, and I don't think that's true. I think good journalistic writing is as creative as any other. I think journalists are inclined to structure their work differently, and of course are more concerned about being accurate, including certain facts, than someone who is seeing the story in his or her own head. We must reflect reality. And even though perceptions are always different from person to person, and there's no such thing as being perfectly objective, journalists try to represent all sides of the issue and to be as fair as possible and include all kinds of points of view. I got the idea to write the book about Senator Warner when I was doing my master's thesis, because it was about the unicameral and the committee system, and particularly the Appropriations Committee, of which he was the immediate past chair. He was already on to another job at that point, but had been chairman of Appropriations for 14 years. So when I did the thesis, I interviewed him at length about the committee and how it worked and his viewpoint on government. And as I was talking to him and realized what an impact he had had and how long he'd been in office and all the things he was involved in, I thought, you know, someone should tell this man's story. Excuse me. And I couldn't do it right then because that was not the point of the thesis. But when I finished the degree, I wrote to him and said, you know so much about what's happened in Nebraska politics and government, and I would really like to put that down and write your biography, and would you consider letting me do that? And he said, yeah, you know, I've thought maybe somebody ought to get some of this stuff down that's in my head. He was a very self-effacing man, and would probably, I can't imagine that he ever would have suggested on his own that someone write his story. But he also had, he realized that he had an enormous institutional memory that should be tapped, and so he agreed to let me do that. I went and talked to the senator for an hour and a half a week from January until the end of May. That would have been 1995, I guess. And then I spent hours talking to all kinds of other people about him. I went through piles of newspaper clippings and documents that he had saved, well, or that his staff had saved. They were in no order, you know, they were just there in a box. And I waded through those, and then I went back and found more things by looking at the microfilm copies of newspapers and so forth. Then I read a book, whose author I can't recall at the moment, about writing for story. And the point, it was, the man who wrote it has won 3 Pulitzer Prizes for long feature stories, newspaper feature stories. And his pitch is that even though you're writing nonfiction, you're telling a story. And you should frame things in a way that will tell someone's story, even though you're basing it in fact. And that was very helpful. It helped me decide how I wanted to structure the book. And then I forced myself. I had taped all the interviews, but I took notes too. And I would tell anybody who's ever planning to tape an interview, don't do it without taking notes also, because otherwise you're stuck. You have to transcribe every single word, and it'll take you forever. I used the tapes as a backup, as a way to make sure I got quotes exact, but I didn't use them as the primary source of information as I wrote. But I made myself go through these pages of notes, you know, this huge stack of notes, and color code all the different subdivisions of the story that I planned to tell. And after I'd made an outline, you know, and then I did all this color coding. And then I started writing. And it was terribly difficult for me to do the outline and make myself color code, because what I wanted to do was jump in and write. And I just wanted to start. And I held on and made myself do it the other way, and I'm glad I did, because even though I changed direction, I think, a little bit from where I'd started, it kept me on track, it kept me organized, and it kept me going towards the story.
I would like to introduce to you Charlyne Berens. She's a native of Michigan but has been a longtime resident of Seward, Nebraska. She's a former State House reporter and was a newspaper publisher for over 14 years. Excuse me. But she's currently an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska's College of Journalism and Mass Communications. Research for her master's degree in political science led her to interview State Senator Jerome Warner, and this reinforced her belief that about all she had heard about him was true, and that was that he was, quote, a powerful politician who had maintained his integrity throughout a long legislative career. Tonight she'll explain to us how she came to write her book a little bit more and share excerpts from it and discuss Senator Warner and his activities. So with that, let's introduce and welcome Charlyne Berens.
Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to talk about Senator Warner. I think the book came at just the right time. I made it, I almost said heroic, and I don't know if I don't want to describe myself that way, but I made a real effort to finish it before he died, because I wanted him to be able to enjoy it. I wanted him to be able to bask in a little of the recognition that it brought to him, because he deserved it. He definitely deserved it. He had been such an influence. People looked to him for information about the past and inspiration for the future of the state. And he had a lot of both. He had an institutional memory that just wouldn't quit. And he had a long-term vision for the state that was equally impressive, and that he kept working away at as his duties led him to do in the legislature. As Vicki said, I got to know Senator Warner when I was working on my master's thesis, which was about the unicameral and the committee system, and particularly the Appropriations Committee. He had been the chairman of the Appropriations Committee for 14 years, which is a long time to be chairman of one. I mean, that's a long time to serve in the legislature, much less to be the head of one very powerful committee. And so I talked to him about his work in the committee and about the committee itself several times. I interviewed him several times as I was doing the master's thesis. And in the process, I realized how much he knew about Nebraska politics and about the legislature. And it really impressed me. And then I got to thinking, you know, years before, in the early 80s, I was talking to a couple of people one night, one of whom happened to be a lobbyist, and the other one was just somebody else who was interested in politics. And we were talking about politics in general and Nebraska politics in particular. And I think at that time there were some shenanigans going on amongst some of the state senators whose names I will just leave out of this discussion. But I said, you know, it just seems that the people who really have a lot of power in politics are often the ones that you really can't admire much. You know, they use less than forthright methods to accomplish their goals, and you have to wonder even sometimes about their goals. Is it really possible to be both honest and powerful in politics? And my friend, the lobbyist, who had had a lot more experience with this than I had, said, "Nah, I don't think so." "Oh, no, wait a minute," he said, there's one exception, Jerome Warner. And I had always remembered that, and remembered that his name would come up frequently in news stories, you know, as the powerful senator, the powerful chairman of the powerful Appropriations Committee, was often the way it was said in the newspaper. But also all kinds of admiring comments about the senator and his vision and his integrity and his leadership skills. So after I talked to him and got to know him a little bit, I thought somebody ought to write this down. Somebody really ought to tell his story. And he is was such a self-effacing person, so modest, which is unusual in a politician in itself, I think, that he would never have suggested that. And I wasn't even sure he was going to let me do it. But he said, "Yeah, I've been thinking about it, and I think it's probably true. Somebody ought to get this stuff down," because he knew that he knew a lot about Nebraska's legislative history that ought to be recorded for the rest of us. And so he said, "Okay, you can do it." So in January of 1995, I started going to see him for about an hour and a half once a week over lunch. I mean, he would he would have his sandwich, and I would start asking questions, you know, and then we'd be at the end and he'd have eaten 2 bites because we were talking the whole time. But at any rate, we did that for about 6 months, 5 to 6 months. Then I started interviewing a whole lot of other people who had worked with him and who knew him. Then I went back, talked to him some more. Then I wrote a draft of the book, and I kind of was just working on it. I had a friend editing for me and giving me comments, and we were not hurrying until I found out that the senator was seriously ill with cancer, and that if he was going to be able to see this book come to fruition, I had to hurry up and finish it. So I did. I did a lot more quick interviews, did some revisions, and we got it done. And we had a book signing ceremony at the state capitol on March 4th, and he died on April 20th. So he was still able to enjoy the book. The place was packed, the book signing, and it wasn't for me, and I didn't intend it to be for me. It was for him, and he deserved it, and so I was glad that it worked out that way. As I interviewed him and got to know him and heard from other people who had worked with him, I became more and more impressed with the man and what he had done. I didn't set out by any means to dig dirt. You know, this is not to be an expose. And the longer I talked to him and the more I got to know about him, the more I was convinced that there wouldn't have been any dirt to dig if I had wanted to. It just wasn't true that there was anything in that man's past, in his actions, that was reprehensible. He wasn't perfect. Nobody is. And people disagreed with him, because you always have disagreements with people. But he was the epitome of the public servant who really had the public's good in mind. He was elected first in 1962 and re-elected, well, at that time yet the legislature was elected every 2 years. And so he ran again in 64, and then after that it changed to a 4-year term. So he was re-elected 10 times, or elected 10 times, I believe is the way it was. That's a record. He held the record for the longest-serving Nebraska state senator. Ernie Chambers has it now, since Senator Warner is gone, or he will have, you know, if he serves a little bit longer. But he didn't set a record, didn't get reelected by staying away from controversial matters. Sometimes he jumped in himself, sometimes he was pushed into controversy. He didn't shy away from it at all. He really did have an impact on what happened in Nebraska. He left his mark, I think, in 2 ways. And that's the name of the book, Leaving Your Mark. He left his mark in two ways: by influencing major legislation, the way the state does its business, and by serving as the model of the citizen legislator. And that commitment to service is something he learned at home. I want to read to you a little bit of the introduction of the book that talks about how Senator Warner came to be convinced that politics was the life for him. State Senator Jerome Warner says he always knew he would go into politics. It was, he says, like knowing I'd get my driver's license when I turned 16 or knowing I'd go to the university. It was a foregone conclusion. It was a conclusion he'd learned from his father, Charles Warner, himself a state senator and Speaker of the Nebraska legislature when it became a one-house chamber in 1937. Politics and public service were in the Warner blood and in the family's dinner table conversation and in their everyday lives. I remember going to town with my dad when I was a kid, Warner recalls. Almost every time somebody would stop Dad on the street and say, "Charlie, you got a minute?" "I better have," Dad would say. "I work for you." And he and his father would stop and hear out the constituent and more often than not talk to several more along the way before they finished their business and returned to the farm. Charles Warner took seriously the needs of the people he represented. Politics in the Warner book meant service. To Jerome Warner, it still does. Take the office, for instance. One might expect a plush office in the state capitol for a senator who has spent 34 years in the legislature and has been the speaker and the chairman of the body's most powerful committees. Instead, Jerome Warner works out of a cavernous office with no windows. Voices raised anything above a modulated murmur echo off the ceiling, and fluorescent bulbs provide a stark white light. Visitor and occupant alike enter the office down a long hall that further separates the room from daylight. The seasons could change, and the occupant of this office would have no way of knowing. Why this office? The senator looks toward the ceiling out of the corner of his eyes and smiles a small smile. Nobody else wanted it, he says. He moved to room 1401 in 1991 when he was chairman of the executive board and in charge of assigning offices for all the senators. This was space nobody else wanted, Warner says. I tend not to ask someone else to do something I'm not willing to do myself. The work Warner's been willing to do himself has been considerable. Through it, he has made an impact on Nebraska's present and future, sometimes in short-term ways, whose effects are felt almost at once, and just as often by laying the groundwork for long-term change whose effects may stretch over years or even decades. He managed to accomplish both kinds of change during his 14 years as chairman of the Nebraska Legislature's Appropriations Committee, and over the span of his legislative career as a leader in state aid to schools. The emphasis is on the long-term side when it comes to Warner's influence on the state highway system and the way it is financed, and his concern for the state's university system has been obvious year in and year out during Warner's 34 years in office. He was there at the creation, says Henry Cordes, an Omaha World Herald reporter. He remembers the original purpose of programs and legislation. He tries to make sure it doesn't get lost when the legislature decides to revisit issues. But it's probably as chairman of the Appropriations Committee that he made the biggest news most often. He was the Appropriations Committee, says Senator Don Wesley of Lincoln. He forged alliances that were blocks of granite, and he could build what he wanted with those blocks. What he built was the state's budget. To the Appropriations Committee is given the power of the purse, and that's a lot of power. Scott Moore, who succeeded Warner as chair of Appropriations in 1990, describes it as a new take on the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. Being chairman of Appropriations made Warner one of the most powerful people in the state, probably as powerful as the governor. Warner told the Lincoln Journal in 1987 that governors can propose and they can veto, but their input between the two is limited. They can help set the stage for change, but only the legislature can cause it. Although most Nebraskans probably still associate Warner with the Appropriations Committee, his service there is only part of the picture. Long before he was elected to chair that committee, Warner had already fought major campaigns that changed some of the fundamental undergirdings of the state. For example, Nebraska's system of state aid to schools has Warner's fingerprints all over it. The new senator introduced a bill to provide such aid in 1963 during his first session in the unicameral, and again in 1965. It finally was passed in '67. Dick Herman, who was a reporter then for the Lincoln Journal, points out that Warner's bill was the first educational reform proposal that held the double-edged sword. It included both property tax relief, which is what everybody's always seems to be wanting out of school finance legislation reform, and improved educational opportunities for children in property tax poor districts. That's the part that a lot of people tend to forget. Don Walton, who covered the legislature for the Lincoln Star in the 60s, says he remembers how doggedly Warner fought for state aid to schools. When the bill finally passed, there were tears in his eyes, Walton remembers. Warner was a major force in writing state aid to schools legislation in the 60s, says Sandy Schofield, who served in the legislature from 1983 to 90. But Warner's contribution that probably had the biggest day-to-day impact on Nebraska citizens is not directly connected to the Appropriations Committee and has nothing to do with aid to schools. Instead, it can be summed up in one word: roads. He totally revised the way highways are financed in Nebraska, says Jim Joyce, who was a reporter with the Lincoln Journal-Star for 17 years. As a result of Warner's efforts, Joyce says, we have one of the finer systems of public roads in the nation. Ben Nelson, the current governor, says he elevated the whole area of roads generally above politics and certainly above partisanship. Warner is widely acknowledged as the force behind the package of 16 highway bills that passed the legislature in 1967, establishing a system that's still largely intact. It established a way to make sure that future decisions will be based on long-term planning and real need and not just on political games and power. Warner is also responsible for the 1980 legislation that created a formula for setting the state's variable gasoline tax rates. In other words, the Roads Department, this is in another part of the book, but the Roads Department sends its budget to the governor, says this is how much we think we're going to need to repair, replace, maintain, and create new roads in Nebraska next year. The governor sends that as part of his budget to the legislature. The legislature argues it out, in the Appropriations Committee and then in the whole body, and they finally set the budget for roads. And whatever that comes out to, the gas tax just automatically goes up to meet it. This is very unusual. So you don't have the legislature in Nebraska arguing, as many legislatures do, incessantly about what to do about the gasoline tax, which is a sore subject for a lot of people. So he took that out of the process. Sandy Schofield says we're pretty fortunate not to have political roads. His career also reflects his interest in a lot of other issues, and higher education was one. Warner is considered the single person most responsible for bringing Kearney State College into the University of Nebraska system. He also was a major player in the creation and passage of the constitutional amendment that created the Coordinating Commission for Post-Secondary Education, something many of my colleagues at the university don't have a lot of love for, but anyway, Senator Warner was very much involved with that. And furthermore, he's known as a passionate supporter of the university. Doug Bereiter, now in the Congress, U.S. Congress, was vice chairman of the Appropriations Committee during the first 2 years that Warner was chairman. He's had a more favorable impact on the progress of the University of Nebraska than any other legislator, period, Bereiter says. But Warner's most long-term contribution may be his institutional memory, something that both stems from and contributes to the major legislative successes to which he can lay claim. Ben Nelson calls it stability, being able to provide a historical perspective. Lee Rupp, a former state senator, calls it a steady guiding hand. Retired Nebraska Senator Jim Exon put it directly, he's Mr. Unicameral. Scott Moore says, paraphrasing Harry Truman, the only thing new is history you haven't read yet. And Moore adds, but in Jerry Warner's case, he was there. He knows the intricacies of how things happen. Moore has also often gone to Warner to ask him how some particular law transpired and found himself involved with a resource who could bring history and policy perspective to nearly every contemporary political issue. Governor Nelson says Senator Warner is the best argument there is against term limits. Not every politician who's been a powerful force in government for more than 3 decades continues to earn praise from colleagues, observers, and constituents. But Warner is not every politician. Abraham Lincoln said, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power. From all accounts, Warner has met the test. Colleagues say that he has earned their trust and that of his constituents and the wider population of Nebraska by being consistent, honest, self-effacing, and kind. This book focuses on the major contributions Warner has made to the state of Nebraska, but Warner himself says he's just doing what he was brought up to do, serve. And as his father did, he works for the citizens of Nebraska. So that lays out for you some of the main topics that the book deals with, some of the main contributions that Senator Warner made to legislation in this state and to the way the state does its business. I think the most important thing about Senator Warner is that he is perhaps one of a minority of politicians who have been able both to be very influential, very powerful politically, and still maintain an integrity that nobody doubts. That doesn't mean that people didn't disagree with him, because of course they did. And it doesn't mean that he was perfect, because he's not. But he managed to keep the ideal of public service so firmly in mind that even when he was powerful, even when he was exercising a lot of influence and a lot of political maneuvering, not under the table kind of maneuvering, I don't mean that, but he knew how to use the system. But he was doing it always for what he felt was the greater good, was the public good, not for his own aggrandizement, either in terms of power in the legislature or personal gain of some kind. And I hope that that is the most important thing. I hope that's the final impression people take away from the book. I think having spent so many hours talking with him, and then with other people about him, and then going back and talking to him some more, I really had well, I really admired him. I admired him when I started, but I wasn't sure what I was going to find. And after I got to know him, I realized that I probably had the privilege of talking to one of Nebraska's greatest public servants, certainly in this era and possibly ever. There were some times when I talked to Senator Warner that I was amazed by his insights into politics and government and the interaction of the community. He would say things that I had studied in my political science classes, you know, and he would say them as someone who was living this. It was, I know he talked about how he believed, he volunteered this, I didn't have to prompt him, but he believed that a representative in a democratic system should be a trustee rather than a delegate, which is the Edmund Burke philosophy. That you are elected to represent your people, your constituents' interests, but you're also elected to use the brain God gave you, and not simply to take a poll and then you know, vote the way the constituents' majority happens to say you should. That you are the one involved with the information. You know more about it than they possibly could at the time, and you need to use what you know when you make a decision. He came right out and said, no, I'm a state senator. I'm not the Waverly senator. I'm not just representing my own district. I have to look at what's good for the whole state. I think that's a broad-minded view that not necessarily every legislator has. One of the most touching moments came when I wanted to talk to him about his wife, Betty, who had died a year earlier, because it was still very difficult for him to talk about her. And they had been very, very close, and he was devastated by her death. She died in spring, a year before that, and then his brother had been killed, his only brother, his only sibling, in a tractor train accident just a few months later. He had had a really hard time. And when I said to him one day, okay, now, I think I'd like to ask you about Betty, and he just about broke down, and I said, oh, let's leave that for another time. We're probably running out of time today. So I decided that I couldn't do it that way. I couldn't approach him, you know, just say, okay, now we're going to talk about Betty. So I would just sort of slide into it. You know, if we were on a subject where her name came up or something that she had done was mentioned, I'd just pursue that, and I'd get him talking about it before he really realized what he was doing. And I got quite a lot of information about his relationship with his wife that way. Time flies when you're reading your own stuff and having a good time, so I will try to hurry along here. I'll leave a few things out. Let's start with roads. The heart and soul of highway legislation in Nebraska was authored by Jerome Warner, says Jack Pittman, now finance administrator at the State Highway Department. Pittman was employed in the department's finance office in the late 60s and worked with Warner to develop the package of highway legislation. It wasn't that Warner necessarily had a deep and abiding interest in highways. He was always concerned about roads in his own district, but he hadn't made it the topic a priority in his legislative life. But once he got involved, he wasn't content simply, oh, I didn't realize I wrote a pun here. He was not content simply to address the surface issues. Instead, he insisted the legislature plan for the state's roads as far into the future as possible. The legislature had begun to study the highway needs under the leadership of Senator Jules Burbach of Crofton in 1965, spurred by the fact that there was $500,000 worth of federal highway money available to the states. The state senators were eager to get their hands on that money, and each had his own idea about where and how it should be spent, preferably, of course, in his own district. Everybody wanted on that study committee in 1965, Warner remembers. But by 1967, it became apparent that the study had recommended more changes than the state would be able to handle, and many of the recommendations were going to be controversial. In those days, the legislature's interim study committees were not standing committees, but were appointed by the executive board at the close of the session. So as Warner was chairman of the executive board that year, and he sent out a form to all the senators asking them to tell him which interim study committees they'd be willing to serve on. He said, where 2 years before, at the end of the 65 session, everybody wanted on the Highway Study Committee, by the end of 67, nobody wanted on it. That included all but one of the original members of the study committee. So since none of the senators wanted to do it, the executive board decided to make itself the study committee. And as chairman of the exec board, Warner became chair of the study committee. They held close to 20 public hearings. And then they got a consultant's report, and that's when it started to get controversial, Warner said. But he was ready for the whole thing. With a few years of legislative experience under his belt, what he did was listen to all the tapes, about 40 hours worth of tapes from the hearings on the previous round of discussions. And he took notes on what people said. I've always had a good memory, Warner says. If I really concentrate, I can do it well. Of course, sometimes I remember dead wrong, he said. But in the case of the roads hearings, he remembered pretty well. People would come and testify again who had testified at the first round of hearings. And they'd make their remarks, and then I'd look at my crib notes, Warner says, and I'd say, well, 2 years ago you said whatever it was they said, which of course flattered them immediately and made the whole process go smoother. Lee Rupp says he's a bottomless pit of patience. Warner will listen to all those people talk at all those hearings. They'll listen to 3 to 5 hours of things that could probably have been said in 2 to 3 minutes. And that patience served Warner well during those hearings. But then they had to put together the plan, the actual legislation that they wanted to have passed. And this is where Warner got a lot of help from a person who was to become one of the most important influences in his life, his future wife, Betty Person. She was the legislature's sole researcher in the 1960s. She is a former newspaper reporter, and she took seriously her job to serve the senators' needs for diverse information. Warner and Person based their plan on the consultant's recommendation, but modified it to include suggestions from the hearings or simply things that they thought would work better. They came up with a weighted formula, which is still in effect. Warner said it was no secret we had done that, but I assumed we'd be very vulnerable because this was not, quote, done by the consultants. In that era, this was the 60s, a great deal of deference was paid to consultants' recommendations. But what these consultants wanted to do, we didn't want to do. So instead, Warner and Person applied their own expertise to the problem and came up with their own plan. Warner's skill at guiding the plan through the legislature showed again his growing leadership and influence. It was 1969, the last year of the unicameral's biennial sessions, the last year in which there was no limit on the number of days the body could meet. But there was a limit on the number of days in January during which bills could be introduced. The deadline was at noon on the 20th legislative day. Betty Person, the legislature's researcher, had completed work on those 16 highway bills and taken them to the bill drafters in December, Warner says. He had checked on them periodically after the unicameral convened in early January, but every time he checked, he was told the bills weren't finished. On the 20th legislative day, the last day on which the bills could be introduced, Warner finally got the pile of highway bills from one of the legislature's bill drafters. As the senator looked through the drafted bills, he found plenty of surprises, wordings that were different from what he had asked for, and items that were brand new to him. He was horrified at the potential for political mischief in the incorrectly drafted bills, and he knew he didn't have much time to correct the errors. He had a page take the bills to person with a note saying, these things look bad. And she came back to the legislature a little bit later, about 11:30, the deadline was at noon, and said the bills had wordings in them that would have killed the legislation and gotten people all riled up. When Warner checked the dates on the backs of the form, he found the bills actually had been drafted January 3rd and 5th and 7th, but they weren't delivered to him till the last minute. He figured somebody was trying to keep him from changing the mistakes that had been found. Something drastic had to be done. I stood up about 11:45 and moved that the rule for introduction of bills in the first 20 days would be interpreted to mean that any bill requested by 4 o'clock that afternoon would be considered as having been introduced, Warner says. And the motion passed. Partly, he says, because other people had bills in mind they still wanted to introduce, and partly because he happened to be the speaker at the time, which probably gave him a little extra leverage. So he took the bills back to the bill drafting office and asked that they be redone. The drafting office said it was too late to request redrafting. The deadline was passed. But Warner said, no, it's not too late. The floor just adopted my motion to consider any requests made by 4 this afternoon, and now I'm making a request for 16 new bills, except this time you're going to bring them to me in rough draft. He didn't say what the look on the face of the bill drafter was at that point, but there had to be some shock because he had just managed to completely circumvent the rules that were being used against him. So he had this package of 16 bills. It was pretty complicated, and it was difficult to get it all through the maneuvering on the floor. He recalls that Terry Carpenter, whom some of you might know that name, he was a senator from the Scottsbluff area for years. They called him Terrible Terry. He was a wild guy. Very influential senator. And Jules Burbach of Crofton, another influential senator. And they had managed to amend one of the bills that dealt with the gasoline tax so that the increase would have been higher than the legislature was likely to approve. It would have killed the bill, Warner says. So that night, Betty and I sat in her office and we wrote speeches for 6 senators to say on the floor to get it reconsidered. We figured out the order in which they were to speak. We had them spaced in different parts of the floor so people seemed to be coming from different locations. Warner gave the speeches to the senators who supported his version of the bill, gave the list to Lieutenant Governor John Everode, and asked Everode to recognize the people on the list in order, mixing in any other senators who wanted to speak to the bill. And it worked. Each senator spoke according to schedule, and the motion to reconsider was approved. Carpenter didn't appreciate what had happened, and Warner said, as he usually did when he got mad, he went home for a week. Jules Burbach didn't protest, and as a result, Warner didn't have too much more trouble with the bills. Eventually, the entire package was approved with all the controversial stuff in it. That showed Warner's understanding of how the legislature works. One person alone can't accomplish a lot. Instead, a measure needs a reasonably large number of people who support it and a few who know enough about it to convince others to get on the bandwagon. But the person who orchestrates the presentation the way he did on the subject of the gas tax shouldn't talk about it, Warner says. In the case of that 1969 debate, no one knew about the plan except the 6 senators who made Warner's case and the lieutenant governor who presided. If you're successful at doing something up there on the floor, the last thing you want to do is talk about it, Warner says. In some respects, it makes the others sound used, and that's not true. We structured the arguments, but the legislature has a very efficient internal balancing system. And if the majority feel like they've been maneuvered or used, or someone takes more credit than they ought to, it will always get balanced out in time. I think getting to know Senator Warner made me less cynical about politics. I think I'm probably less cynical than most people about politics anyway, and I think that may be true of people who study political science in general. We tend to become apologists for the system because we say, well, but you don't understand. It's supposed to work this way. It's supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be full of argument and contention. But obviously, there are a lot of people who misuse the system. Even when it's working the way it's supposed to, there are some people who are taking advantage of their position, of their privilege, of their opportunities for their own sake. And seeing somebody like Senator Warner and hearing him talk about how he felt that the majority of people he had served with in the legislature over his 34-year career were good, honest people who wanted to do the right thing, gave me more faith in our system of government, messy as it is. I think that people beginning to write, maybe people who, maybe I'm just naive, but if I were giving advice to someone about starting a nonfiction book, I would say be prepared that it's going to take you longer than you think, that you're going to have to go back and check on facts and follow up on questions and get more answers, and an interview will lead you down a road that you didn't expect, you didn't even know existed, and will take more time. And I also would say make sure you get yourself organized before you start. Don't fall into the trap of just jumping in and starting, and you'll be frustrated by doing that. You'll be much better off if you force yourself to make a plan and stay with it. Revise knowing what you're doing, not just by accident. Just a little bit about the Appropriations Committee and his service there for 14 years. Warner got a good introduction to the power of the Appropriations Committee during a 1969 budget crisis. During that busy, now he wasn't the chairman then yet, but during that busy legislative session, the last of the unicameral's biennial sessions, and the one in which those 16 highway bills were passed, the appropriations bill was not reported out of committee until August, Warner says, even though the fiscal year had started July 1. When the bill reached general file, senators started offering amendment after amendment. In those days, a committee amendment needed 25 votes to pass, but amendments offered by individuals required only a simple majority of those on the floor. Many senators were absent a lot, and so amendments were passing with 8 yes votes and 6 no votes and nobody else there. And as a result, the final appropriations bill included a budget far larger than what the state's resources could fund. The legislature moved to recess for 2 weeks so the Appropriations Committee could meet to work out a solution. But the chairman at the time, Richard Marvel, went home, and the committee didn't meet, and nothing was happening. During the second week of the recess, Warner went to the Capitol and worked with the 3 members of the Appropriations staff to develop amendments to cut the budget by about $8 million, which was a significant amount in 1969. Actually, it sounds pretty significant to me now, but at any rate. When the unicameral reconvened, Speaker Warner took his regular spot on the legislative floor. In other words, he was not presiding. The lieutenant governor presided, and he took his seat as a senator. Warner introduced his amendments, and they were all adopted. The victory led to what the senator still says was one of my favorite headlines, quote, "Warner cuts $8 million from budget." What better publicity could an elected official ask for? And this was even before he was chairman of the Appropriations Committee. When he became chairman, he ran against Doug Beereiter, actually, for that job. Let me rephrase that. Beereiter was also very interested in it, but dropped out so that it wasn't actually a battle on the floor in the election. But Warner became the chairman and Beereiter the vice chairman of the committee. And they worked together closely and developed new procedures. It had been true that the Appropriations Committee would hear a request on the budget from a particular department, and then they'd vote, yes or no, from the Roads Department. And then they would hear something from the Department of Health and Human Services, and they would vote yes or no. And then they would hear something from one of the other departments, and they'd vote yes or no. Well, they kept voting yes and approving all this money, and then by the time they got to the end, they would have spent more than they had. And Warner saw right away that this was probably not a real wise way to be doing it. So he changed the procedures so that they would hear all the requests first and then consider them as a lump, which, as you know, makes a lot more sense. If you were just to go shopping and say, oh, gee, there's a coat, I really like that, and buy it, and then you'd go along and you'd say, hey, there's a pair of shoes, I really like those, and buy them, and then you'd say, there's a new sweater, I really like that, and buy it, and then you'd realize, gee, I only have 20 bucks. You'd be in big trouble. You'd be much better off looking at all the things first and then making a decision where to spend your money. And that's what Warner did for the state. The Appropriations Committee gets to be very close, very cohesive. One reason is that they serve on no other standing committees. Most senators serve on several standing committees. Another reason is that the appropriations process is long and time-consuming. Senator Diana Shimmick of Lincoln, who served on appropriations in the 80s, said it's like falling into a black hole. You don't get to do much of anything else during that time. And the state's budget is complex, and only those who work with it regularly are likely to understand it. I was pretty good at putting things together, Warner says. That was partly because I could read people pretty well. And it was also partly because of the way he operated as chairman. For one thing, he allowed people plenty of time to be comfortable with the issues. You have to give them time to change their minds, the senator said. Vard Johnson, who was chairman of the legislature's Revenue Committee during the 80s, told a World Herald reporter in 1986 that Jerry Warner is a master at causing members of the Appropriations Committee to feel they're part of the whole. He has elevated institutional dynamics to an art form. Lee Rupp puts it a little more bluntly. He cultivated that committee like a row of radishes, the former state senator says. Don Wesley, considered one of the more liberal members of the legislature, tells a story involving a very conservative senator who was assigned to the Appropriations Committee under Warner. Part of what Appropriations recommended that year was an increase in state employee salaries that Wesley thought were too generous. As the legislature debated the proposal, Wesley, the liberal, found himself arguing for less spending, while the conservative senator argued for more. Wesley remembers how astonished he was by the role reversal and how impressed he was by what Warner had accomplished to get the professed conservative to that point. I congratulated Warner on teaching his course on government spending, Wesley says. He played the committee like an instrument. They started with screeching and scratching, but by the end, he could play whatever he wanted. Well, I'm going to have to write a dissertation. That's my first concern. And I already know that that also will be about the unicameral legislature. I'm very interested in Nebraska politics. And in the field of political science, a lot of people aren't particularly interested in state government. It's not a real hot field, not like the presidency and the Congress and so forth. But because I live here, because I've lived here a long time and I intend to stay here, I find it really fascinating. And if I were to go on and write another book after the dissertation, it would probably be something else about Nebraska politics and government and history. How do I want to leave my mark? Well, teaching journalism is a terrific opportunity to leave your mark. Teaching is a good way to leave a mark. If I can help students learn how to be fair and thorough and honest in their writings, in their dealings with other people, that'll be leaving a terrific mark. If I can do more to document what goes on in Nebraska government and politics and help people understand how it works, that would be leaving a mark that I'd be proud of. But the teaching really gives you an opportunity that if you can help students develop and become good journalists, you can leave a mark all over the country, all over the world. He himself did not want to admit to prominence. He says, prominence in the legislature is often mistaken for leadership, but the two are not the same. Prominence is essentially determined by the media, and leadership is an internal matter. Leadership may shift with the issue and with a particular senator's expertise in an area. It may also depend on how reliable the other senators perceive him or her to be. Prominence may not leave the long-term impact that leadership does, but it's not necessarily all bad. People prefer to be represented by someone they think of as an effective legislator, Warner says, and simple publicity can help in that regard. And finally, he would admit that, yeah, he probably fit into both categories. As I mentioned earlier, he suffered some very sad times in the last few years of his life, after his wife died and then his brother. Many who knew him were touched by Warner's grief and loss. Henry Cordes, the World Herald reporter, said he was sorry to see what the senator had gone through. You have to admire him personally, Cordes said. Despite the personal trauma Warner experienced, he never missed a beat in terms of being responsive to the state and the public. It was that concern for the state over the long haul that most observers of the Nebraska political scene cited when they talked about Jerome Warner. His legislative colleagues, current and former, other public officials and news reporters with whom he has worked, as well as his constituents, agree. Not only has Warner left his mark on major and minor legislation, but he's also been, and remains, one of the most, if not the most, respected elected officials in Nebraska. In other words, he's met Abraham Lincoln's test of character. Doug Berens says He's been able to wield power because he's well prepared before he reaches a decision or speaks out on a matter. He has a reputation for hard work and careful study. There are other avenues to power, Don Walton says: bluster, threat, deal-making, pressure, going to the public with things that are misleading. Warner chose to work hard. Might have been harder, more difficult for him, but it means his influence has been longer lasting. Scott Moore also notes that Warner sticks with his belief and speaks his mind, even if it's not popular. People respect that, Moore says. Warner is a realist who will adapt to changing circumstances, but refuses simply to go along with what public opinion polls indicate to be the majority view. Governor Ben Nelson says, he has never abused power. If he didn't have integrity, people wouldn't have confidence in him. If he abused power, he'd lose it. Warner planned to stay in the legislature as long as he could, and he did. He served as chairman most recently of the Revenue Committee, and he made it through the Revenue Committee hearings this past year, even when he was really sick. He had stopped going to the sessions of the entire body so that he could save his strength to preside over the committee hearings. And he made it to the end. And on the last day of the committee hearing, he refused, all the members of the committee were paying tribute to what he had done, knowing that he wouldn't be back. And he just brought it to a real casual conclusion. But he had planned to stay in the legislature as long as he possibly could. He said, and this was before, what I'm going to read you now, he said before he became quite so ill, but he said, I had no thought I'd be here this long. I wasn't elected the first time I ran in 1960, and I've always sort of assumed I wouldn't be elected the last time I ran. He was surprised he had survived at the polls in light of his involvement in so much controversy. I've never shied away from controversy. As long as I feel right inside about the side I'm on, I'm comfortable. But he had always reminded himself that he'd feel better if he was going to be defeated at the polls because he had done what he thought was right instead of what was politically popular. Lots of things are attractive about public office, Warner says. Ego, recognition. It's easy to believe it's you getting all that attention, but it's not you, it's the office. It's not the ego building or the recognition that make the effort worthwhile. Instead, it's the opportunity to serve, to help, to improve things. Some nights I go home feeling like I made something a little better than the day before. It's that point of view that he had learned from his father. When you get all said and done, there's nothing there but that you feel you contributed something, and you'd better assume you're going to do it just for that reason. Well, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure.